This podcast may contain disturbing content for some listeners. It's intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. This is True Crime XS.
Got the weirdest update in my emails. You know, I get all these press releases that come from different places.
Mm-hmm.
And so this one comes directly from the Vermont State Police. And it's mid-March. This is kind of out of order for us, by the way. Like we were doing some other episodes, and then I was like, there's a lot of like news and sort of current stories I wanted to talk about. And I wanted to record one of our Texas cases, which is what we're doing today. But this comes from the Vermont State Police, and it ties back into Brianna Maitland's case. They're saying that they used advanced DNA sequencing techniques to identify a very old DNA sample from the 2004 disappearance. For those of you who may not know, which I don't think as many people in here, we've talked about Brianna Maitland before. She was a 17-year-old girl in the town of Montgomery, Vermont, who went missing after work. There's a very famous image of her car sort of wrecked against this barn. When she went missing, there were a couple of searches like right around the area where her car was, which was a 1985 Oldsmobile backed into an abandoned building. It's like a mile away from the restaurant that she worked at. I think it's the third time that they searched in the area, they found items of interest. Now, they don't specify what the items of interest are. They just say that they found items of interest near the car. And from those items of interest, which I assume is something disposable, food-related or cigarette butts or something, there is a DNA sample. This DNA sample, originally, they just sort of cataloged it. It was collected. It was identified. It was added to CODIS multiple years ago. And then it was compared to samples from a dozen people, or a little less than a dozen people. I think it was 11 people. And no match was ever found. But in the fall of 2020, the state police in Vermont sent those samples over to Othram. And Othram is the Texas-based forensic sequencing lab that we've talked about before. There was a fundraising page set up, and people were donating money to do some DNA testing there. Well, apparently the state police, have been able to locate, interview, and obtain DNA samples from possible donors, and they found a match. So they have matched person, their DNA, to the DNA that was found on the ground near Brianna's vehicle. Now, unfortunately, that is the whole update, was that they had matched it. They didn't reveal who it is. They didn't reveal if it's relevant to anything.
It may be something, and that would be great, but I kind of feel like if the person willingly gave them their DNA, it's probably completely benign. It's not gonna get anywhere.
Well, it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't say specifically how they got it. It just says.
Well, it said they spoke with several different people, and one of those people ended up matching the profile.
Yeah, it just says they located, interviewed, and obtained DNA samples from possible donors. So, yeah.
It'd be great if, but it's so vague. And, you could end up, anybody that potentially had ridden in her car at any point in time, could have left something that had DNA behind that could have wound up on the ground near her vehicle.
Yeah.
But, maybe not. Maybe they really are, on to something here. Maybe that person has more information that they didn't want to share previously.
Yeah, that could definitely be true.
Right. And so because they did release the update, it makes me hope that it is something.
Yeah, that's how I feel about it right now. I'm really just mentioning it because it was just sitting there, and I was like, well, I mean,
well, if somebody was driving by and threw their cigarette out the window, I mean,
yeah,
it could have nothing to do with her case or whatever, but yeah, it's about time some sort of leads start happening there.
Yeah, I would agree. It's been long enough now that hopefully some kind of closure can come of that particular case. That one and Maura Murray are two that I'm just always wanting. I always want to know, like, what happened to the two of them. And it's not, I wouldn't put them on like a wish list of case. They're just really, they're cases that frequently pop into my head, and they're brought up a lot. It's not super normal for us to get an update in either one of those cases that sort of means something. This one, I'm not saying it does or doesn't. I just thought it was interesting that like they identified that and then thought to put out a press release and email it to all of those of us on the list there.
Yeah, it is interesting. We'll see, I guess, if something comes out of it.
Yeah, and so, I guess in terms of the season moving on, because this is season 3 of True Crime Excess, and I didn't start with like a really specific goal. I had some small goals in mind. Like we started out with the Ellen Greenberg case. I've been talking to some different people that are related to different cases to see if we can do. I think one of those is in Texas. That's probably the one that is most recent. To see if we can do some interviews with family members of missing and murdered folks or suspicious deaths. And while we were doing that, a serial killer has popped up in North Carolina. A potential serial killer has popped up in North Carolina. There's not a lot of information about this guy yet, but they've had him in custody for quite some time. His name is Daniel Prince. Did you read anything about Mr. Prince?
I believe I read what you sent me. I don't know that he's going to be a serial killer.
He's definitely a weirdo.
Well, it seems like the people that he's killing, it seems like that he was connected to all those people, right?
Yeah, we don't know
It's
yet.
the,
It seems
it's like
that
the
way.
Food Lion parking lot situation.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So he's definitely a weirdo, and it's alarming what they've kind of unfolded there.
Yeah, they're saying he's got 3 or 4 bodies. 2 of those bodies are connected to each other, and it seems like one is. I pulled all this paperwork. We haven't sorted it enough to really turn it into episodes yet. But in one of the pieces of paper that I found, this guy is charged. He's behind bars with no bond, but it's on federal firearms charges, which puts him. That's something we've talked about. That's pretty common. They'll use whatever they currently can charge him with in order to hold him and kind of vet him. They've been holding on to this guy for it's going to be a year. But the idea is that he sort of euthanized someone on behalf of someone else. And it's a mom, an elderly lady that he supposedly euthanized using essentially prescription medications and food, and then he potentially did it to another person. Well, what the mom, her daughter, is also a missing person out of Charlotte, North Carolina. So one of the cases is out of that area. One of the cases is actually out of South Carolina. But like I said, there's a stack of paperwork on him that doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet. Clearly, federal authorities think there's something to him. I don't know if he will be a serial killer per se. He's got this wild look about him. The one thing that stood out to me was that in the warrant, and multiple news sources picked up on this, so I'm not being super original here. It stood out to me, and then people started talking about it. There was a go bag that had zip ties, a taser, crushed pills in a plastic bag labeled Ativan, partially full pill bottles that were prescribed to one of the missing people, and lubricant. I thought that was interesting that all of that was in a go bag with zip ties. I don't have any idea what's going to come of this case, but at some point I'm probably going to come back to it and be like, all right, we need to talk about this one.
He definitely has something going on that investigators are looking into.
In terms of the season moving along, we may have something on Israel Keys. We don't know yet. We're looking. We basically had to go back through, weirdly enough, our own work. We had to go back through our own work, and you heard something in there that might have tipped us off to something related to the comparison searches. We don't know for sure that that's a thing yet, but we're going to go, like you said, it sort of rang a bell, and we're going to go look and see if that might be where our summer episodes head or not. And I mentioned that we potentially would be talking about some other Texas cases, but we have one for today that it's a pretty old Texas case. It's a Texas case from the early 90s. Specifically, it's from December 13th, 1991. This is a murder case that has been solved, but has some other stuff that's happened with it over the years. This is out of Hunt County, Texas. And this is the death of a woman who went missing December 13th, 1991. And her name is Sandy Dial. There's not a huge mystery in Sandy's case in terms of something that you have to go hunt and find the information. But what is interesting about her case is how it came to be solved. And Sandy Dial had a sister named Janet Hawley. And when Janet Hawley's sister was murdered, so when Sandy was murdered, Janet became obsessed with figuring out how to solve this case. And she ended up being the one who turned up some of the information that became crucial to finding out who had killed her sister.
And so she was found in her own vehicle, I believe face down in the back seat with her. It looked like a staged sexual assault because of her clothing was messed up and pulled a little off of her. It was a weird situation, right? But ultimately, the responders felt like all of it was staged. But she was out in the middle of nowhere. And I think it was maybe within a day or two of her being missing that they discovered her car and her body.
Yeah, they found she wasn't missing for a super long period of time.
Right, and she'd been shot in the back of the head with a shotgun, I think.
Yeah, it was a single shotgun blast. It was a messy and violent death.
Yeah, it was pretty terrible.
What ends up happening here is Janet Hawley pretty quickly meets a ranger, and the ranger is Don Anderson. He's a Texas Ranger who's going to be working her sister's case. This was considered a really notorious murder case for this area. They started putting everything together related to the killing. It's one of those that isn't just one person killing one person. And that's what made it really interesting. So I pulled this old D magazine, which is Dallas's magazine. And you can actually find this on dmagazine.com. A woman named Glenna Whitley wrote up an article on June 1st, 1993. It was published. It's called Murder in the Family. It's got some interesting tidbits about this case, but the way they describe everything is worth kind of passing on to the audience. So this is directly from the article. The card table is covered with a pretty tablecloth, and atop it sits an IBM computer, the monitor glowing a luminous blue. Wearing her uniform, which is sweatpants and a hand-painted T-shirt, Janet Hawley punches a button and watches as the printer begins shattering, slowly, page after page. It spurts out a copy of the journal she's kept for more than a year, a journal she knows may be evidence in a murder trial someday. Nearby, the king-size bed is covered with pink and green flowered comforter. Janet bought the comforter, matching dust ruffle and pillow shams through a mail order catalog last August. And now it's Easter. She's just found the time to paint the room pink and dig those linens out of the box. Decorating her house used to be one of her favorite activities. Janet would spend hours at craft shows looking for quilts and country knickknacks to occupy special niches in her small, immaculate home. In a neighborhood so new that few of the trees are taller than her husband, James. Dalmatians and fire trucks adorn her 2-year-old son's bedroom. Her 10-year-old daughter's room is pink and frilly. Janet's attention to detail extends to the exterior of the Hawley residence in Sachse, Sachse, a small town north of Garland. Her mailbox looks like a little blue barn. But in the last 18 months, there's been no time for decorating. No time for the Garland Junior League or the PTA. No time for anything but her crusade. Since the day her sister Sandy Dial was found murdered, Janet Hawley has talked and thought of little else. She still works during the day cleaning houses for a handful of longtime clients, but she wears a pager so that no matter where she is, Texas Ranger Don Anderson can contact her. Most nights, when her children are finally in bed, Janet sits down at the card table, turns on the computer, and begins to type. The IBM is slow, obsolete. It's a loan from a friend. When she first got it, Janet could do little more than flip the on-off switch. She taught herself how to use it to keep track of her investigation, her notes, her files, her letters to Ranger Anderson. Her best friends know him as Don, the Ranger, the other man in Janet's life. She talks to him almost every day, often several times a day. It sometimes seems, even to Janet, that she spends more time communicating with Anderson than with her husband. Janet and the Ranger first talked on December 15th, 1991, the day she learned that her beloved older sister was dead. Sandy, 34, had been missing since Friday, December the 13th. Janet had spent a restless Saturday night trying not to think the worst. But early Sunday morning, the worst was confirmed. Sandy's body had been found in her car on a rural road near Royce City, a small town 20 miles east of Garland. She had been killed by a single shotgun blast to the head. 28-year-old Janet had gone with her husband and her brother to the medical examiner's office to identify Sandy's body. But she was so upset she couldn't bring herself to look at the photographs. Janet's husband, trained as a paramedic, verified Sandy's identity. That afternoon, Ranger Anderson phoned the Garland home of Shirley and Herbert Harper, Sandy and Janet's parents. Grieving, shocked, Janet and other family members had gathered there trying to fathom what had happened. Janet took Anderson's call, and in a slow Texas drawl, Anderson asked what was going on in Sandy's life. If Sandy had business in Royce City, Janet couldn't think of any possible reason that she would be so far from her Garland apartment on Bobtown Road, especially on a Friday night. She told him about Sandy's recent divorce from her abusive husband, how she had lost more than 150 pounds, about her love affair with an engagement to a man named Leon Andrews. From the phone, Janet could see Leon sitting at her mother's kitchen table, hunkered over, weeping, as if he were in physical pain. Janet felt sorry for Leon, but she was angry at him too. In a rush, it all tumbled out. How Sandy told her friends and family she was afraid of Leon's former wife, Loretta. Sandy had said that Loretta repeatedly threatened her, that she had thrown a beer bottle at her door and screamed at her in public for sleeping with her husband. Anderson said little. When Janet asked if Sandy had been raped, he said he wouldn't know until the autopsy was completed. It appeared that Sandy's clothes had been removed after her death. Perhaps it was the work of a serial killer or a necrophile. A necro what? Janet asked. He explained that was someone who had sex with dead people. She had never heard of anything so disgusting, and Janet and Sandy had grown up in a very religious home. As children, they had been sheltered, not allowed to watch TV or go to the movies. Now she was hearing that her sister not only had been murdered, but could have been attacked by a necrophiliac. Then Anderson asked a really odd question. What size foot did Leon have? Someone involved in the murder had left muddy prints, but it was a small foot, wearing a shoe with an underslung heel and a pointed toe. Like a lady's foot? Janet asked. Could be, Anderson replied. That confirmed her suspicions. Janet wanted him to arrest Loretta immediately. Don Anderson simply listened, like a human vacuum cleaner, sucking up all available bits of information. Although neither realized it at the time, it was the start of an unusual relationship. The taciturn investigator with more than 30 years of experience, and a woman not yet 30 whose life had run in comfortable circles around her husband, her 2 children, and her small house cleaning business. Janet Hawley had turned sleuth, digging to find out who had murdered her sister, Sandy. Then feeding that information over to Anderson, who was 30 miles away in Greenville, Texas. But as she dug, her initial feeling that Loretta was the killer began to waver. Could Sandy have been killed by someone else, someone that she cared for, someone so deceptive, so manipulative, that she never realized her life was in jeopardy? And as she got closer to the truth, Janet began to wonder, would she and the Texas Ranger ever be able to prove it? I guess you're what a Texas Ranger should look like, Janet said as she shook hands with Don Anderson. Anderson had the air of an old-fashioned lawman with a weathered face and a square-cut jaw beneath a cowboy hat, a solidly built body wearing tan western-cut dress pants, a white western shirt with a silver star on the chest, a dark tie with a Ranger tie tack, and cowboy boots. Although they were indoors, he kept his hat firmly on his head. It was Thursday, the day after her sister's funeral, and Janet introduced her father, brother, and sister-in-law to Anderson. Her husband, James, had returned to his job as a quality control manager for a sprinkler manufacturer. The other family members had driven out to Greenville to Anderson's cubbyhole at the Hunt County Criminal Justice Center. And as they drove east on Interstate 30 past the Royce city limits, Janet wondered which of the rural roads the killer had driven that night. She still knew little about the crime. One of the things about this crime that was so interesting, and one of the reasons I'm bringing it up, first of all, it's just a standard run-of-the-mill homicide. Like, it sounds sort of interesting when they start describing it, but the truth is, the police really didn't have any information.
Yeah, they didn't have any information. It wasn't, I mean, yeah, it seems like it would be a standard run-of-the-mill homicide, but it was actually, like, really odd for a random woman to be in her vehicle on a random rural road, like 20 miles away from where she lived, and shot in the back of the head like that. Like, it was weird.
It was weird. So this relationship between Janet Hawley and Don Anderson sort of drives this. And as you follow along, Anderson he's a pretty standard Texas Ranger, in my opinion. The writer is very complimentary of him. I've met very few Texas Rangers that I've had a bad feeling about, or read about very few Texas Rangers that I've had a bad feeling about. But there's been a couple I sort of like wondered what was going on. For the most part, this guy gets involved from the very first day. What happens is the Hunt County Sheriff calls and they just ask for a ranger because they have a homicide, and the ranger that's assigned is Anderson. He comes out and he and Janet hit it off just from the perspective of finding Sandy's killer, and Janet gets pretty consumed. I would say I probably don't know, like personally, the level of this type of consumption.
I don't either. Especially not at this point in time, because you have to keep in mind we're talking about like 1991.
Yeah.
And so it's a lot more, like, I doubt the IBM she had any way of getting on the internet.
Well, I mean, I hate to say what internet, but like really at the time,
there wasn't any.
It was very limited. Yeah.
Right. And so she was actually having to do more than just sleuthing online.
Yes. What happens next is, even though they've kind of focused in on Loretta, it's very difficult for Janet to separate the idea that Loretta could have harmed her sister without Leon being involved. And so Leon is with Sandy. Loretta is his ex-wife.
He's actually gone back and forth between the two. And I think that's sort of a layer there that adds to the tumultuousness of like what might have happened, because of course when they immediately think that they've spotted what could be a woman's shoe, and then you've got a situation where Loretta's husband has chosen to be with Sandy, like there's going to be animosity there. And so it satisfies one of the motives that we commonly see for murder, which would be over love, right?
Right.
And so initially she was, and it makes logical sense, right? That somebody's going to kill the woman who's stealing their husband.
I mean, yeah, I think it's the low hanging fruit in this situation. It's the easiest thing to grab at that like helps you, one, cope with the tragedy, and two, head down this path where you think that you're going to solve a thing.
Well, sure. And it's actually something that human nature dictates could happen.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So, and like you said, they go back and forth. Like Leon is choosing between them for like a year. Yeah. Although he does get a divorce from Loretta, and he had, at this point in time, he had asked Sandy to marry him.
Right.
The family, though, ultimately decides that they don't want to involve Leon because the preacher basically says, look, if Loretta did this, you don't want Leon being mentioned in the funeral services and your memorial. So they leave Leon out, even though, you know, Janet is in a position that she defends him. One of the first things they do is in the following weeks after Sandy's death, Janet and her brother's wife, Byron is her brother, and it's his wife that gets involved. They start going through essentially Sandy's belongings, but specifically trying to take care of Sandy's family. So Sandy has daughters, and her oldest daughter, Miranda, is hearing impaired. So they're going through trying to make sure that anything Sandy had left in terms of life insurance or in terms of the finances, that they are capturing it and cataloging it. There were 2 life insurance policies that Sandy's parents knew about. And one of them is through her job at Excel Logistics. She has a policy there for $30,000. In digging through that, they learned that Sandy's ex-husband, a man named Lynn, is still listed as the beneficiary of that policy. She had told her mother that just before Christmas, she had an appointment to change this policy to make her parents the beneficiaries, but this change was never made. In the stacks and stacks of paper they're able to collect from Sandy's apartment, Janet finds documents from Farmers Insurance Group saying that Sandy had purchased a $75,000 life insurance policy from the company on November the 19th of 1991, so just a couple of weeks before she passes away. This policy, these papers, name her children as the primary beneficiaries, with her parents listed as the contingent beneficiaries. She had renewed her own car insurance, and the salesman had said that since she was a single parent, she needed life insurance as well. So even in all of this, they found a canceled check to the insurance company showing that the first premium had been paid, and that document came with a physical form, a paramed, and that a paramedic had come to do that exam on Sandy at her apartment just 3 days before she was killed. In addition, they found drafts that were made out to MetLife for the insurance. And I mention all of these like little pieces of paper because they are what catches Janet's attention when she's digging through all of this. Janet has a conversation on the night that she found out Sandy was dead that sticks in her head. A friend of Sandy's named Dylan Bella had called Janet asking if Janet had found anything in Sandy's belongings related to life insurance. She tells Janet that Sandy had made her the beneficiary of a policy to ensure that Sandy's 2 daughters received a college education should anything happen to her. Now, Dylan and Sandy had known each other for a little bit less than 10 years. They had met while working at a paper goods company called James River. Sandy was a data entry clerk there. And Dylan, she had called Janet before, after they were no longer working together, and Dylan had gotten her license to sell insurance. So Dylan was trying to sell Janet an insurance policy that was designed to provide funds for future college costs for her children, and Janet had declined. Janet had actually only met her in person one time at a birthday party for Sandy and Janet's mother. Janet recalls her just coming in and out, and she had wondered about Sandy's friendship with Dylan. But what Sandy had told Janet was that Dylan was married and also had a sugar daddy who would give her money and diamond jewelry. Sandy's opinion was that Dylan was sort of glamorous, and they described her as a femme fatale. So Dylan's intrigues made Sandy's own rocky marriage at the time with Lynn seem even worse in comparison, especially after Dylan started seeing Lynn's brother, Donnie Dial. And so Dylan is married. She has a sugar daddy, and she's also dating Sandy's brother-in-law. You follow all that?
Oh, I got it.
From the first time that they met, Janet thought that Dylan appeared to be pretty much a successful upper middle class woman who carried herself gracefully, and she just looked expensive. That's how she described her, as looking expensive. She had expensive clothes, she had expensive jewelry. She was just sort of well-to-do. Sandy told her that Dylan was fond of the best of everything and said that even her children had to have designer clothes. But Dylan's appearance was not that of what she was portraying. She was actually only 5'4" tall. She had bleached blonde hair, and she had acne scars from when she was younger. So she wasn't drop dead gorgeous. And Janet could not figure out how Dylan got all of the men in her life. But she knew that Sandy looked up to her. And the biggest question for her was, why would Sandy make D'Ellen the beneficiary of anything to do with insurance policies for her children? And we see this a lot. This is like the one big thing that I have seen off and on over the years. People do weird shit with life insurance. Would you agree?
This would have been a red flag for me.
Yeah. This is beyond the weird shit.
Especially mentioning it during that particular conversation.
It's a little early, don't you think? The kids aren't going to school tomorrow and she just died.
It's like this whole thing. I can't believe that more red flags didn't go up. Some random friend talking about, did you find the life insurance that I'm the beneficiary of? D'Ellen goes a step further and explains to Janet, Sandy's sister, that Sandy didn't think anyone in her family was capable of making sure that her girls went to college.
That was like, I couldn't believe the jabs were being made that quick.
And it was to throw her off, maybe.
Yeah.
But to me, like that even if that were to be the case, that's not what you would tell your friend's sister.
Not only that, you're making a calculation there that turns out to be false, because Janet's memories were when she and Sandy were getting out of high school and getting married. Her memories were that her parents had offered to them, both Janet and Sandy, the opportunity to go to college. So she firmly believed that would have also carried over to Sandy's children.
Which makes the line that nobody in the family was trusted to do it completely false.
Right. So it was a bad calculation on D'Ellen's part. Sandy had relied a lot on her parents. It's said that she talked to her mom every day on the phone, and nobody mentions this. Nobody mentions that D'Ellen's going to be in charge of this. Although they knew that D'Ellen and Sandy had been close, Janet was pretty sure they had drifted apart in recent years. D'Ellen ends up getting divorced from her husband, Clay Fuller. And she keeps on seeing Donnie Dial, who is Sandy's brother-in-law. And Sandy tells friends and family that Donnie doesn't like her. He didn't want Sandy and D'Ellen to see each other anymore. In fact, the Friday night that she disappeared, Sandy told her daughters she was headed to D'Ellen's house, but not to tell their father, Lynn Dial, her ex-husband. She didn't want to get back to Donnie, but for some reason, Sandy's plans apparently changed. D'Ellen says that Sandy didn't come over that night. On the phone that Sunday night, after Sandy's body had been found, D'Ellen tells Janet that Sandy was a real ass when it came to men. She had probably gone out drinking and picked up the wrong guy, or been picked up by the wrong guy. And D'Ellen confided that Donnie Dial, who, by the way, is a former police officer, had been out to the scene earlier that day, and he said that he thought it looked like some kind of weird sex crime. That's like a weird conversation to have also. Like, why would you want to tell your sister that it's your friend's sister that her death was a weird sex crime?
Or that she was a real ass when it came to men. Yeah, she's definitely overcompensating here.
Janet kept very careful track of all this in her journal, by the way. That's how we have this like sort of preserved in time, even 2 years after the crime.
It was like over manipulation.
Yep.
It's weird. It's like she inserted herself and was starting this whole path that she had planned out.
Yes, and she takes it a step further, and she doesn't even seem sad. She seems excited. D'Ellen seems excited. She said she thought that Sandy's life had been insured for $10,000 with Metropolitan, but that the purchase had been so long ago, she didn't know if it was still in effect. The whole thing sounded improbable to Janet, and Janet goes looking for the Met life insurance. She begins to think that perhaps Sandy did name D'Ellen the beneficiary of a life insurance policy. She remembered having a conversation with Sandy in the months before her death. After swearing Janet to secrecy, Sandy confided that D'Ellen's sugar daddy had given D'Ellen $30,000 in trust for each of her two children's college funds and a $30,000 life insurance policy. D'Ellen was making Sandy the beneficiary of that life insurance policy from her sugar daddy. Do you have life insurance on any of your friends?
This is bizarre to me. Like, this
Like, so the sugar daddy gives her an insurance policy and she makes her friend Sandy the beneficiary. Supposedly, that's how the conversation goes.
Right. And then Janet, and Sandy is the one who told Janet this.
Yeah.
It's not DL, and it's Sandy saying, like, oh, yeah, my friend, she's left me an insurance policy for $30,000.
Yeah, and so Janet says that this made Sandy very proud, and it makes me very confused, but it is what it is.
But it makes Janet think that perhaps that because she had said that maybe Sandy was like returning the favor.
Yeah, that was the idea. So December 18th is the morning of Sandy's funeral, and Don Anderson calls Janet. She doesn't want to talk to him, so they're going to meet the next day. But before hanging up, he says he wants her to look at the memorial service and to take notes of anything that seems... He wants her to look for anyone behaving strangely and to take note of anything that seems odd. Now, 400 people show up at this service. That's a lot of people for 1991.
Yes.
Despite her grief, Janet tries to follow Anderson's instructions. She didn't notice anything weird, except for DeEllen. Janet sees her leaning against the wall of the church as everyone else is getting in line to drive to the cemetery. On the phone with Janet that night, DeEllen explained that her daughter had locked the keys in their car at the church and she'd been waiting for the locksmith. This made Janet wonder, if that had been my best friend, I would have hitched a ride to the cemetery to say goodbye, even if I had to ride in the hearse. So Thursday, Janet and other family members talk to the ranger for 3 or 4 hours. They tell him what they can recall about Sandy and her life in recent years. And Janet told him about DeEllen and the life insurance, but she kept coming back to Loretta, which is Leon's ex-wife. She's coming back to the warnings, the threats, the jealousy. Anderson asked questions but provided little information back, and that infuriated Janet. She later remembers one strange question. Anderson asked Janet's father if he had sent Donnie Dial to the scene to look for Sandy's purse, which was missing. And Herbert Harper, Sandy's dad, says no. Janet saw Anderson exchange glances with a Hunt County deputy standing nearby, and she knew something was going on there. So this is DeEllen's boy toy, who also happens to be the ex-husband of Sandy's brother, or Sandy's brother-in-law.
Right.
He's made up an excuse of why he pops up at the crime scene where he had to say it was a weird sex crime. And it doesn't hold water because apparently what he told the deputy was that Sandy's dad had sent him out there to look for Sandy's purse. But the ranger picks up on it, asks him about it, and that falls apart. So on Friday, Janet wakes up, she gets on the phone and calls Leon. She calls Sandy's ex-husband, that's Lynn. So Leon's the current, ex-husband is Lynn. And she starts calling other people, asking them what they knew about Sandy's final days. But she kept coming back to this weird $10,000 life insurance policy. And she thought something isn't right. She had found a check for $1,478 to Farmers for the $75,000 policy. Why was there a draft on her account for that if the MetLife... She wanted to know why there was a draft on Sandy's account for $18 if the MetLife policy was only $10,000. So what she was looking at is she's got a check for $1,478 over here for a $75,000 policy. She wants to know why MetLife is charging her $18 if this other policy is only $10,000. In her mind, she thinks the MetLife policy has to be more than $75,000. The reason she thinks this is because Sandy didn't have a lot of extra money and had a really tight, specific budget. So there would be no reason for her to shop for the one policy and then pay for a much smaller payout, more money. Janet recalls, she would call her, invite her over, and Sandy would say, I can't come over. I don't have gas money. All of these little things start to add up. And shortly before Sandy's death, their brother Byron had gone out and rigged Sandy's Pontiac's muffler to keep it from rattling because Sandy couldn't afford to replace it. So Janet goes and calls the Mesquite office of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company asking if there was a policy on Sandy Dial. The clerk asked her the name of the beneficiary. And she said, I think it's DeEllen Bella. The clerk comes back and says, yes, there is a policy for $100,000. Trying not to become hysterical, Janet hangs up the phone and she dials Anderson's number to tell him what she found out. After that, it seemed like every time she talked to someone who knew Sandy, she learned that the Ellen had been calling them first, talking about the investigation, talking about the insurance, and how Sandy didn't trust her parents to take care of her kids. Why then had Sandy made her parents the beneficiaries of a $75,000 farmer's policy? This wasn't adding up for Janet, and it wasn't adding up for the other people.
And it was just mean.
It was so mean. I can't, can you imagine, every word? It's like something out of a, bad cop procedural movie. Every time you pick up the phone to call someone, this crazy woman has already called them and also been talking junk about your family.
And tainted everything. Yeah.
So in Janet's journal, she wrote that after I discovered that the Ellen had lied to me about the amount of the life insurance, I felt it best I not deal with her anymore. The next time she called, she wanted to know, now what's being done in the investigation and how long has it been since you talked to the ranger? During the whole conversation, I was evasive and not answering any of her questions, and this went on for about 30 minutes. I believe she got the drift because I never heard from her again after that.
Man, she's a lot more cordial than I would have been.
Yeah, she was very nice. Sandy's friend does not disappear. So the Ellen Bella does not disappear from all of this. In fact, what ends up happening is Janet starts digging for every bit of information she can find. She goes to, they describe these rural dumps that she goes to. She's just looking for anything. And she ends up going to 3 Dallas area psychics. She's searching for information about Sandy's death. And the Texas Ranger thinks that she has lost her mind. He tells her that we don't have time to waste following up leads about psychics. And he said, I don't believe in it. But Janet kept going. She was like, it might help and it can't hurt. That became her attitude to all of this. One psychic tells her that Sandy's missing purse is under a piece of tin like that from the roof of a barn near a trashed commode at a dump near a cemetery. Sandy's body had been found in her car on Hunt County Road 2646. The ranger tells her that there is indeed a small dump that's not very far away. Of course, Janet is going out there, and hidden behind the tall weeds beyond the dump, there are a few old graves. She gets her parents and her best friend Kelly Gravely and several other relatives. They all drive out to this site. Guess what they find? A toilet and a large piece of tin. But no purse. There was nothing there that looked like it might be Sandy's, so it's another dead end. So there's been 3 months since Sandy's death, and there's been a lot of dead ends. By January, Janet had settled into this routine where she would clean houses, and then she would mull over whatever new information was coming in while she's doing that, and then spend her spare time on the phone trying to get information about Sandy's murder. The end of the routine was if she learned something, she would call Don Anderson. She had also discovered more about Loretta Andrews. This is Leon's ex-wife. Weeks after Sandy's death, Leon went back to her. Janet got frustrated because she didn't believe that the Texas Rangers seemed to be taking Loretta seriously as a suspect. And after interviewing Loretta, Anderson flat out said that he thought it was unlikely she had anything to do with the murder. He said she was upfront and admitted that she'd threatened Sandy. She felt like Sandy stealing Loretta's husband away was justification for the threats. And Loretta had agreed to the divorce and had been living with another man. Now, she also had an alibi. She'd been in a wedding rehearsal the Friday night that Sandy disappeared. And Anderson told Janet there was just not any evidence that Loretta was involved. Now, Janet wasn't completely convinced about her innocence, but she decided she would consider other possibilities. And she asked the Rangers about Jake. And now Jake's last name is not used in any of the articles I found. And a man named Steve Lynch. Apparently, both of these people were having affairs with Sandy at some point in her marriage. Jake was a couple years younger than her, and Sandy was miserable in her marriage. So in the late 1980s, they had been hooking up. And what she told Janet about this time was that she knew her marriage to Lynn was a mistake, that he was verbally abusive with her. And during her pregnancy, she gained a lot of weight. She weighed almost 300 pounds. So their marriage lasted 12 years or so, and she had gained that much weight. She's almost 300 pounds. That can't be a good marriage. She had lost her self-esteem. She had met Jake because she was living next door to his grandparents, and he was a ne'er-do-well. He was a troubled young man who had a few run-ins with the law. Pretty soon, Janet realized that their relationship might be more than a friendship. Sandy did admit to her that they had been having an affair. Janet noticed because she started to pay attention to her appearance. While she's seeing Jake, she starts losing weight, a lot of weight. Over the course of the next 3 years, she loses 140 pounds. And in 1990, Sandy filed for divorce from Lynn. She didn't want to get married to Jake because Jake was always in trouble with the law. So she decided she didn't want to go back down that path. And Jake says that the two parted on relatively good terms. One of Sandy's friends told Janet while she's doing her investigation that Sandy was afraid she might get dragged into his problems. So after Sandy is murdered, the ranger goes to visit Jake, who is in the Dallas County Jail on a burglary charge. But he told Janet that Jake didn't really have a motive and his shoes were a size 12. So they weren't even close to matching the prints from the crime scene. Janet asked about Steve Lynch. And Sandy had met Steve, which I think one article indicates a pseudonym for Steve, and another one says it's his real name. But there's a Steve Lynch. So he either is representative of another name or whatever. It's not about his name. It's more about like the relationship. This is a tall guy who works as a house painter, very handsome dude. She met him at a fish fry at a cousin's apartment in early November, but this was only 6 weeks before her death. Leon was once again waffling about his relationship with Sandy and had gone back to Loretta. So Sandy was dating around, and she started dating Steve. This group that they all met with, they went dancing at the Villa End East Motel in Mesquite. It was a place that Sandy called a hole in the wall. But Sandy told Janet the next day that she'd have the time of her life with Steve. She and Steve had danced and partied all night, and she took him home. They slept together. It was the first time in her life she'd ever done something so wild and so irresponsible. And maybe he was the one. She confided to Janet that maybe this was her Mr. Right. Later in the month, about a year after they had first become lovers, Leon came back into her life with roses and divorce papers. So this is later in November. Sandy told Steve that she was going to get married. And Steve was so heartbroken that he congratulated her. He was not interested in a serious relationship with her at all.
So no hard feelings there.
Yeah, no hard feelings at all. So Janet wondered if Steve had really taken it that well, if that was Sandy's take on it all. And her suspicions were heightened when they found out that Steve's first wife, this is Steve Lynch, first wife had been shot to death in her car in a Collin County park in 1987. Now, the death was ruled a suicide, but the coincidence was like Michael Peterson level eerie.
It was very eerie. That sent up a flag for me, but ultimately it's nothing.
Nothing, yeah. Janet started to probe into the Villa, which was the place that they had danced all night. And what I saw online, I did not see any place that you can dance at the Villa. I just want to point that out, that if you go looking for the Villa in this area of Texas, I do not believe that is vertical dancing that you are doing, because it is a bad motel, and there does not appear to be like even a restaurant or a bar. Like the bar is literally like a bar with stools. There's no dance floor. There's no anything.
Yeah, no comment.
So D'Ellen had told the family that Sandy had called her the Friday evening that she disappeared and wanted to go get something to eat. D'Ellen declined, saying she had already eaten supper. And Sandy told her she was going out and she might come by, but she might go to the village. When D'Ellen was later asked if Sandy could have said the Villa, she said, "Oh, the Villa, that's what it was." So had Sandy gone to the Villa for a last fling with Steve Lynch? This is what Janet is wondering. Janet found out that Ranger Anderson had already paid a visit to Steve Lynch, and more specifically, Steve Lynch's closet. Anderson had gone looking at Lynch's shoes, also a size 12. So he could not have fit the muddy prints that they had found. So Janet's obsession begins to take a toll on her emotions. She starts getting paranoid. She starts getting nervous. She asked her brother to come stay with her one day while she cleaned a client's house. Her father had given her a key ring with a can of mace attached. And one evening, while her husband was in paramedic school, she heard a noise on the roof and she called the police, convinced that the murderer was now coming for her. All they found was a cat.
So she's going out of her mind, basically.
Yeah, she's losing her mind, wanting to know what happened to her sister, but she's also when you run out of suspects, you start to think that maybe it could also be something that affects you.
Right.
Because you don't know, like all the personal things seem to be coming to a dead end. You start putting yourself on the killer's list. It's irrational, but not to the person who's doing it while all this is going on. She's zapping herself emotionally.
Sure.
About a month after the murder, Janet woke up one morning and couldn't get out of bed. She cancels her cleaning jobs for the day, pulls the covers over, and just goes to sleep. That afternoon, she called up Ranger Anderson, who gave her an assignment. He wanted her to call the Garland Crime Stoppers to see about getting a reward fund set up. So she called Larry Rollins. He's the man in charge of Crime Stoppers there in town, and learned that they could put up $1,000 for information leading to the grand jury indictment and arrest of Sandy's killer. What's a grand jury? Janet asked. She spent several hours talking to Rollins, learning how the criminal justice system worked. 4 days later, Janet had raised an additional $4,000 to add to the original $1,000 Crime Stoppers reward, and had organized a small army to post flyers showing Sandy's picture in her car. On a Saturday in late January, she called local television stations who sent crews out to tape the 75 friends who showed up to post the reward notices. That evening, Janet's efforts made Sandy's murder one of the top stories on the newscast for channels 4, 5, and 8. It even made the Spanish language station. When mapping the routes, Janet and a friend drove to County Road 2646 where Sandy's body had been found. We were scared to death, she said. But as she drove along the dirt road, she realized that the murderer couldn't have chosen the place at random, especially in the dark. For the first time, Janet began to think that Loretta was not responsible for Sandy's death. She believed it was unlikely that Loretta Andrews could have known about this road. It also made something that she had heard through the grapevine from a relative of a relative who knew someone at the Royce City Police Department hit home. Janet could look south from where Sandy's body was found, and there across the pasture was a house that Donnie Dial and his ex-wife Debbie had bought when Donnie worked for the Royce City Police Department. Out of all the rural roads between Garland and Royce City, why did Sandy end up near this old house? The next day, one of Janet's relatives who had gotten the assignment to post flyers in D'Allen's neighborhood in Rowlett called. He had driven through that area again and discovered that every flyer he had put up had been taken down. Everything kept coming back to D'Ellen Bella and Donnie Dial. That's got to give you a little bit of like a direction at that point, don't you think?
I think so. I wasn't entirely sure. It doesn't really detail what's happening with all the insurance stuff at this point, but
Don Anderson, he goes out to close to the scene of the murder. And he points out to Janet that there was a piece of broken white cement embedded in the dirt road. And he told Janet that someone had stepped in Sandy's blood and then in the mud and then onto the cement. And he had a photograph of the print, even though it had been washed away by the rain. So Janet's back out there hunting. She wasn't there literally digging through the trash again, which she had been known to do nearby. But she had come out with the ranger to put together all the bits and pieces that they had been collecting. I guess this would be September of the following year. So this is 1992. Janet hadn't backed off. If anything, she was obsessed that her husband called her aggressive and said that once she sets her mind to something, she goes all the way. And she has a knack for getting people to help her. Kelly Gravely, who was her neighbor, helped her many times and said she makes a friend. She gets close to people, she'll talk to people, and she'll get them to talk to her. She had no qualms about walking up to a bank manager or a court clerk and telling them her sister had been murdered and she needed their help. Most often, people are sympathetic and they would tell her what she needed to know, giving her documents that normally it might take Ranger Anderson a subpoena to get. And Anderson, for his part, said that Janet was resourceful. When he asked if she had a sample of D'Ellen's handwriting, Janet said no, but she was asleep one night when it hit her that in the pile of papers she'd scooped up from Sandy's apartment early on, she had found a card D'Ellen had sent Sandy in the summer of 1991, and it read, "To my sister." And Janet remembered how proud Sandy had been that D'Ellen thought of her as a sister. The ranger was pretty impressed. He said, I'm going to have to put you on study with me. Janet gets a copy of the autopsy report, and she learned that Sandy had the equivalent of a few drinks in her system when she died. She knew that Sandy would never go to a bar alone. So she had to be at a restaurant with someone she knew or at a friend's house if she was drinking alcohol. But Garland and Mesquite at that time were dry. Do people know what dry is anymore? Or?
I probably not. It just means that they didn't sell alcohol there.
Right. So the way that you got alcohol at Texas at this time was you could purchase a membership to go to certain restaurants that participated. And Janet remembered that she had gone to a TGI Fridays in Plano, Texas, with Sandy in the October before her death, and that they had purchased what's known as a Unicard, which is a membership that allows the holder of the card with a photo ID to buy alcoholic drinks in dry areas, but only at specific restaurants as members. And this was just so the sisters could have margarita. So
it's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of.
It's a weird thing, but it's not as far back as you think. Because if you picture, it's only 30 years ago that this was going on.
Yeah, there could still be dry places now. I mean, really.
Janet's able to track down the Unicard, which is sort of like, in terms of how you would use this, it's almost like an MVB card or a reward card. I don't know what people have where they live, but if you have a grocery card, rewards card, it's that. Like, you have to also pay, but you swipe this card. I guess clubs used to do that kind of membership. Like, if you remember clubs that would stamp your little card because you were a member already and you'd already paid the fee, you'd go see bands play or have drinks or whatever. It's like that.
Yeah, it's just funny because if you're swiping your Unicard in a dry county to get an alcoholic beverage, it means that they have alcoholic beverages to sell you.
I know. This is a pretty confusing portion of the story, but it's just the way things worked at the time.
Right, and it's also relevant.
It's relevant here because Unicard had a record that the last time Sandy had used her card was December 18th. When Janet heard this date, her heart started pounding. That was the date that Sandy had been buried. But that wasn't all. The record showed the card had been used that night at the villa. Whoever had killed Sandy had taken her Unicard and was using it. The ranger goes to visit the villa and found that the small Unicard computer was unplugged and sitting beneath the counter. The service was very seldom used, and only 4 cards had been run through that month. Sandy's card had been run through twice within a few minutes. The bartender on duty on the 18th didn't remember running Sandy's Unicard. D. Ellen was the one who had talked about Sandy going to the villa before her death. At this point, for every answer that Janet seems to be finding, she gets more questions. So she finally asked Anderson to go with her to the scene where Sandy's body had been found. She wanted him to explain what his investigation had revealed about Sandy's murder. From the interviews and examination of the physical evidence, Anderson believed that Sandy had been killed on December the 15th, a Friday night, and that at least 2 people were involved in her murder. It was her ex-husband's weekend to have their daughters, so Lynn came to pick them up at 6 p.m. Before he arrived, Sandy told the girls that she would be at D'Ellen's house that night. D'Ellen lived on Horizon Street, which was a few miles away in Rowlett. Leon, at a 6 o'clock break at work, called just as the girls were leaving, and Sandy told him too that she was going to go over to D'Ellen's house. So that's 2 people she's told. She said D'Ellen and Donnie had been quarreling and her friend wanted to talk. Sandy gave him D'Ellen's phone number so he could call her on his 9 p.m. break. At about 6:30, Sandy phoned a friend named Kathy Myers, who lived next door, asking if she wanted to go shopping. Kathy couldn't go, but she told Sandy that if she couldn't find anyone else to go with, to call her back. 10 minutes later, Sandy was on the phone again. In a rush, she told Kathy that she'd found someone and not to worry. So Kathy went to the door of her apartment to call her daughters in for supper and saw Sandy hurrying to her car. No one reported seeing Sandy alive after that. On his 9 p.m. break, Leon called the number Sandy had given him for D'Ellen. A woman answered but didn't identify herself. Leon didn't know D'Ellen and didn't recognize the voice. And when Leon asked for Sandy, the woman said she wasn't there. Sometime that night between 9 and 9:30, Robert Logston, who lived on Forehand Lane just north of I-30 near Royce City, stepped to his bay window to turn on the Christmas lights that ran around the pond in front of his house. He saw 2 cars driving towards his house, but the second car had its lights off. One car was making a noise, like it had a loose muffler. Logston kept watching as the cars drove past the junction of Foreham Lane and County Road 2646. They went past his house and parked briefly. Minutes later, the cars turned around and drove back past his house. Between 9:30 and 10, a farmer was standing at his front yard facing 2646. He saw two cars, this time both had their lights on, turn onto 2646. The farm road runs in front of his house, past the house formerly owned by Donnie Dial, and then it curves back down the pasture to Foreham Lane. The cars drove down to a bend in the road, where the road turns from stone to dirt, switched their lights off, and parked. He thought it was teenagers making out or someone using the illegal dump. On Sunday morning at 8 a.m., an 81-year-old farmer named Pud Campbell was driving down 2646 to check on his cattle. He saw a black car parked by the side of the road. He looked in the windows and saw a nude body lying across the back seat. Badly shaken, he drove to Logston's house, and they called the police. Notified by the Hunt County Sheriff's Department, Ranger Anderson arrived about 9:20 a.m. One of the first things he noticed was the footprints. It had rained on Thursday night, and the dirt road was muddy. Whoever drove the car to the scene had gotten out of the driver's seat, walked to the back left door, and opened it. There was a muddy print where the driver had stepped in Sandy's blood, which had spilled to the ground. The driver had small feet, about 8 to 9 inches long, wearing a shoe or a boot with a pointed toe and an underslung heel. It would have taken a man with a size 4 or 5 shoe to make this print. Sandy's head was flung down on the back floorboard. She had been shot with a shotgun on the right side of her skull, and blood and brain matter on the floorboard were almost an inch deep. At first glance, it looked to Anderson like it was a kidnap and rape. Sandy was nude, and her pink sweatshirt had been pulled over her head and was dangling off of her left arm. Her black leggings, panties, and pantyhose were in a pile on the front seat. That day, Anderson explained to Janet that the prints indicated that the driver walked around behind Sandy's car, opened the other back door, and stepped up into the car to remove Sandy's clothes after her death. Her body was smeared with blood, and she was maneuvered onto her stomach in a sexual position, initially giving Anderson the idea that the killer might have been a necrophiliac. Her tampon had been removed and was on the right back floorboard. An autopsy would later show that there was no sign of sexual assault. There was no sign of a struggle. Sandy's nails were unbroken, and her only injury was the fatal wound to her head. Anderson said she might have been killed there or shot somewhere else and driven to the scene. Although Sandy's purse was missing, she still wore her gold necklace, and in the trunk of the car were 2 commemorative guns and silver pieces owned by Leon, who was still moving into Sandy's apartment. After removing her clothes, the driver shut the back door and walked behind Sandy's car again. He then stepped to the passenger side of another car parked in front of Sandy's sedan, and he got in. Then the second driver drove away. From the tracks in the mud, Anderson believes the second car had 4-wheel or front-wheel drive. The second car spun out like it was leaving in a hurry. As Anderson walked through the scene, Janet began to visualize what had happened to her sister. She saw a photo of the footprints walking up to the side of the second vehicle and then disappearing. She was angrier than she'd ever been in her life. They were going on with their lives and leaving Sandy lying there dead. While he stood on the dirt road, Janet asked where Donnie Dial had been standing that Sunday when Anderson was first called to the scene. "What are you talking about?" He had not seen Donnie until Monday afternoon. Donnie had appeared at the scene and said he had talked to Sandy's father, learned the purse was missing, and had come to look for it. Janet went back to her journal. On Sunday night, D'Ellen had told her that Donnie Dial had been to the scene and that it looked like a weird sex crime. But if Donnie had not been at the scene until Monday, Janet wondered, why did D'Ellen say that at all? So what's happening here is Janet is able to start pointing out things that are unraveling, and she's able to share them with Ranger Anderson. He's able to take a look at this, and what she does next is she gets all the canceled checks from Sandy's bank account. And the signatures are all incredibly consistent. She's able to lay them out on her kitchen table and look at them. And basically, Sandy always signed her name the same way. There were no loops. There were no flourishes. There was nothing fancy about it. Janet goes and compares those. She compares them to the documents related to the Met life insurance policy for $100,000 and the change of beneficiary form, which had the signatures for Sandy Dial on the documents. And they aren't even close to what she sees on all of the canceled checks she's been able to gather. They don't match at all. So only days after Janet had visited the scene with Anderson, the ranger had called to tell her that MetLife had filed suit against D'Ellen Bella and Sandy's 2 children, alleging that the insurance policy had been fraudulently obtained and that D'Ellen was a suspect in Sandy's murder. D'Ellen had filed a claim on the policy, as well as Lynn Dial. So Lynn Dial is Sandy's ex-husband, and he is the father of Miranda and Brianna, Sandy's daughters. Metropolitan contended that the signatures on the documents may have been forged and that Sandy Dial may have had nothing to do with obtaining the policy at all. Not only is it weird that like someone would put their friend down as a beneficiary on a policy when they have other policies, I think it tops the charts of weird when someone just randomly takes out an insurance policy on you.
Well, that's typically not allowed.
Right.
Because it
murder, because of murder for hire, murder for profit.
Really want. In fact, there's an insurance company that has a commercial out right now that I've seen recently, and like its tagline is like "Insurance so good they're gonna want you dead," and I was like, it's the most crass thing I've ever seen like a company do. And at the end, there's like this disclaimer that like any sort of homicidal act towards a policyholder will completely void your policy. But I'm like, that is such a terrible thing to be advertising with. There's so many other things. I feel like a good insurance agent, somebody who can sell life insurance, I would hope that they would be aware. There's no good reason for somebody to be buying life insurance on somebody unless they have like a vested interest in like losing that person financially, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, if it's a husband with a wife or a wife with a husband or children with their parents, and I've even heard of some really strange cases where parents get life insurance on their children and they, you know, for legitimate reasons I had this one acquaintance I knew who had like huge policies on her kids. And, you know, I thought that was weird and it actually concerned me a little, but she explained that in the event that she lost one of her children, that she would need everything to be taken care of because she would need her husband to not work so they could, you know, get through it together or whatever. And I was like, well, if you say so. I think that's a little strange, but whatever.
Yeah, it's a lot strange.
So in this case, they initially had denied. So it's gone from a situation where Sandy is a beneficiary to a $30,000 policy that D'Ellen has taken out, and that it's possible that there was this mutual exchange where Sandy took out a policy and made D'Ellen the beneficiary, except that's not what ends up happening. What ends up happening is they have now discovered, Janet has been able to look through like 75 canceled checks. Again, this is 1991, so you know, paper checks were an actual thing and you'd actually like get your checks back from the bank, right? Yeah. And it seems so long ago. And so now they're seeing that like, oh wait, Sandy didn't take this life insurance policy out. They initially had rejected the application for D'Ellen Bella to get a life insurance policy on Sandy because there was no insurable interest.
Right. She wasn't a relative or a business partner or a family member. Yeah.
But then the agent advised Sandy because D'Ellen was actually having to pretend to be Sandy.
Right.
She had advised Sandy to simply refile the application, naming her children as beneficiaries. And as soon as it was in effect, she could change the beneficiary back to D'Ellen. So I guess once your application is approved, you can change the beneficiary to whomever you want it to be.
I don't know that we want to even say that on here. That just sounds like a terrible way to like make things. But yes, that's what they're saying.
Pretending to be somebody and taking out a life insurance policy as that person is identity theft. It is fraud. Do
Correct.
not do it.
Correct. In this case, she was basically pretending to be both sides of this insurance policy.
Right. She was pretending to be Sandy, who was getting a life insurance policy for D'Ellen. And like she went so far as to have the statement sent to her address and like to D'Ellen's address. So she was straight up stealing the identity here. Now,
she had told Janet she couldn't remember when it went into effect, but the policy was obtained only 6 months before Sandy's death.
Right. It was not long at all. And, I wondered, but without her interjections, I'm not so sure that anybody would have ever caught on to this.
You're talking about Janet?
I'm talking about D'Ellen's conversations with Janet.
Yeah, I could see
because
that.
It starts that very first night where they're having those weird conversations. And of course, I imagine Janet was like really, like her head was just spinning because her sister had just been found dead, right? And so I imagine like she was just sort of listening to what this friend of her sister was saying. And it took her a little bit to put the pieces together. Like, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense. And, I would probably just hang up on somebody who had started talking about life insurance with somebody that I loved had died. I would just hang up on them. But it ended up being vital to eventually solving this.
Yeah, it does. So what this sparks, which while I agree to some extent, like there's two parallel things happening. And I personally believe Anderson probably would have found that anyways, or some version of it. Because of Janet's work, though, I think he found it a lot faster. He ends up getting his hands on, when he hears like the morass that's going on related to the insurance policy, he gets his hands on the actual documents that were submitted. And none of Sandy's fingerprints were found, but D'Ellen's fingerprints are on the application. They were also on the change of beneficiary form. They were also on the $18 check written by Sandy for the first premium, and they were on a consent form for the physical exam, which was performed by a paramedic. But it turns out that was performed by a paramedic at D'Ellen's house, and that was on June 13th, 1991. So who ended up being examined by this paramedic?
Probably D'Ellen.
Yeah, probably her still pretending to be Sandy.
So I have, so she plays off that the policy is $10,000 to Janet. Like she's like, oh, I think it's $10,000, but it was so long ago. Now I would not have necessarily connected the $18 for the $10,000 policy versus like the $14 for the $75,000 policy, because I think that two different companies could have different tiers. But according to the article, Janet did make that connection and thought it was strange. It ends up the policy is $100,000. Okay.
Right.
Now, my question is, going through all the trouble she went through, why didn't she get like $1 million policy?
I think that would have drawn red flags. I don't think you could get away. I think you could get away with 100,000 at the time, but I don't think you could get away with $1 million policy without having a more thorough examination of like you and like your physical person. Also, it would have been probably prohibitive cost wise, because it turns out that D'Ellen Bell is not really who she says she is, and that everything that Sandy sort of admired and like talked about being sort of interesting, it turns out not to be really all that true. Janet finds this out by digging into her life. I guess I have to explain the Dial side of it. So Donnie Dial, who is at this point in time in our story with D'Ellen, it didn't start out that way. He's the easier target for Janet as well. So Janet grew up babysitting Donnie Dial's kids. He had been married to Debbie Dial when they were both 16 years old, and Debbie's parents and sister had been killed in a car accident. For years, Debbie and Donnie Dial had lived on the proceeds of an estate worth $250,000 in a court settlement that Debbie had received after their deaths. So there was $250,000 from life insurance. There was this court settlement related to their deaths. Donnie, which this is an interesting tidbit. I don't really know how this fits in. It's the strangest thing I've ever heard. He was born without thumbs, but somehow he had become a police officer and he had a reputation as an excellent marksman. No Thumbs Donnie did.
I assume you would just like have your pointer finger sort of take over the role of your thumb, maybe.
I picture like the Old West where people would like pull out the revolver but use their other hand to flip the hammer while they pull the trigger.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, you still have two hands. It just seems like it'd be hard to grab anything without thumbs.
But after working for 3 years at the Royce City Police Department, and he had 2 years at the Rockwall County Sheriff's Department, his law enforcement career abruptly ended. He was fired after stopping an intoxicated pedestrian. Although he had been told there was no need for his assistance, he chose to leave the man by the side of the road to go to the scene of a fight. And the man was killed when he walked into oncoming traffic. So after this, Donnie married Lori Suzanne Fox, but that brief marriage ended when he met D'Ellen Bella. Janet began searching for documents at courthouses, police reports, and recorded deeds to find out more about D'Ellen. That's when I discovered all the public information out there in bankruptcy records and divorce papers, says Janet. What she learned was anything but reassuring. D'Ellen Bella seemed to have a pattern of using men and women to build a glamorous image, one far from her humble beginnings. Although D'Ellen told her friends that she was born in 1954...
This is really bizarre.
She actually was born in 1958. She was one of... Yeah, it is bizarre. And
She's making herself 4 years older.
She was one of 5 children of an alcoholic welder and his wife in Bridgeport, north of Fort Worth, Texas. D'Ellen told people she was 4 years older to hide the fact that she was only 14 when she married Robert Gober, who was a member of a rock band. That year, D'Ellen also gave birth to her daughter, Michelle. A son named Michael was born 4 years later. Now, during an interview with the Texas Rangers, D'Ellen told Anderson that Sandy named her beneficiary of the life insurance policy because Sandy knew that D'Ellen was educationally minded. Her daughter, Michelle, attended Baylor University, but D'Ellen never graduated from high school. It wasn't until June 29, 1990, when she was 32 years old, that she earned her high school equivalency degree. D'Ellen was still in her teens when she was detained one night inside a Decatur car dealership. She had bought a new car at the place a few weeks before, but was unhappy with it. She told police she had picked up a hitchhiker and he had forced her to break into the dealership. She stuck with this story, and a source who had known her for years insisted there was no evidence of a hitchhiker. So once she gets in her head what the story is, she never changes it. No charges were ever filed, and D'Ellen divorced Gober in August of 1984. A month later, she married a man named James Clay Fuller, who owned a drywall business in Rowlett, Texas. By talking to people who had worked with Sandy and D'Ellen, Janet learned that D'Ellen had a married lover, a well-to-do Dallas businessman named Gerald. And Gerald has asked in all these materials that his name not be used. Gerald says he did not give D'Ellen jewelry, trust funds, or a life insurance policy. She's a very convincing liar, says Gerald. Her former lover says that D'Ellen got a thrill out of living on the edge. She seemed to take risks that the ordinary person simply wouldn't take, said Gerald. I think she lived in kind of a fantasy world. She would take any kind of chance to get what she wanted. He broke off the affair because he believed D'Ellen arranged for his wife to discover them, hoping it would force them to divorce. And after leaving the company where she met Sandy, D'Ellen got a license to sell insurance policies that could be used by parents to help pay for their children's education. She worked several days a week in Shreveport and told Gerald she was making $100,000 a year. But in 1989, she and Fuller filed for bankruptcy, and papers filed in court say she was making $1,400 a month as a regional manager for Southern Security Life based in Florida. They separated after D'Ellen began singing Donnie Dial, and in 1990, Fuller filed for divorce. Fuller had adopted D'Ellen's children and was awarded custody of them. Think about that for a second. How bad do you have to be that, like, the adoptive parent of your biological children gets custody?
Yeah.
Although Fuller declined to comment, another source says that D'Ellen's children were angry at her behavior and did not like Donnie Dial. D'Ellen told her friends that she'd gotten a job as a postal carrier. It was clear to Janet from court records that D'Ellen was in desperate need of money. In addition to the bankruptcy, there was a federal lien for $10,504 against the Fullers by the IRS. Janet also discovered that D'Ellen was behind almost a year in her mortgage payments. The lender later foreclosed on her house. But one of the most curious things she discovered was in October of 1990. Donnie Dial had sued D'Ellen for damages. Although they had been dating for months, and D'Ellen had told Donnie's ex-wife, Lori Suzanne Fox, in August of 1990 they were planning on getting married, court documents made it appear that they are mere acquaintances, and that she paid Donnie, who has a history of back problems, $20 to climb on a roof to fix a TV antenna. He claimed that he had fallen and was injured, and that D'Ellen had failed to warn him of unsafe conditions. D'Ellen wrote her insurance company, demanding that they settle with Donnie for the limits of her policy, which was $315,000. The company finally paid $29,000. One thing that kept bothering Janet was how Sandy appeared to have paid for a life insurance policy she knew nothing about. Janet went through Sandy's bank records again and found two deposits for $18, which was the amount of the MetLife premium. She went to Sandy's bank and asked for a microfilm of the transaction. One was from July 22nd, 1991. It was a deposit of a refund check Met sent after rejecting the first application from Sandy. The second was a check from D'Ellen dated September 18th, 1991. Janet remembered talking to Joanne Moreau, who was a cousin that was close to Sandy. D'Ellen told Sandy she had some bills to pay that Donnie Dial did not know about, so D'Ellen would give Sandy the money and Sandy would pay the bill. Once, Sandy was concerned her car payment wouldn't clear because D'Ellen hadn't paid her back. With everything she was discovering, Janet started to wonder if she hadn't missed her calling. She and a girlfriend who sometimes helped her began calling each other Sherlock and Watson. But her family was asking, why you? The Texas Rangers are supposed to be investigating the crime. Why was she working on this case day and night? It had been a pretty high cost for Janet. She resigned from the Junior League and her committee's duties at the PTA, but her children hadn't been neglected, and she still was doing most of the things that she did with them, but not everything that she could have been doing with them. Physically, I was going through the motions. I'm bathing them and feeding them, but everything's in a tizzy. I'm not thinking about what's for dinner. I'm thinking about D'Ellen and all the stuff I've dug up about her past. Through it all, she kept pursuing Sandy's killers. Why? I've said that too, says her husband, James. I'm ready for this thing to be over with. When the phone rings, their 2-year-old son doesn't want her to pick it up. The toddler believes that his mother's ear is permanently attached to that phone, says James. I come home at 4:30. She'll be on the phone talking to somebody about the case. And at 11 p.m., she'll still be on the phone. She'll come to bed and want to talk about the case. But he knows why she does it. It may help her deal with the pain, knowing she'll be helping to bring Sandy's killers to justice. And James helps. He makes copies of documents and faxes information for Janet, trying to provide support. But he worries about her. While her fear and paranoia have decreased somewhat, she still worries about going to the grocery store at night. They've installed a security system in their house, and now they keep a loaded .357 in their bedroom. Janet has even taken shooting lessons. Don Anderson says that Janet has never criticized his handling of the case, but he knows that she's disappointed with how slow the process is. I have to stay on this full time, but I can't, Anderson says. He has other investigations, other duties. Janet admits she gets frustrated, and after the recent murder of a store clerk, she was furious to learn that 14 detectives had been assigned to that case, while Sandy's murder only got one Texas Ranger. So Janet says she's looking forward to the day when someone else is indicted and arrested for Sandy's murder. She knows that Anderson knows things he's not telling her. He has not yet released the funds for the $30,000 life insurance policy benefiting Sandy's ex-husband, Len. And Anderson says we have not eliminated anyone as suspects. The MetLife lawsuit against D'Ellen was scheduled to go to trial in July of 1993. In court documents, she denies forging any documents and is asking that the company settle the claim. She declined to comment through her attorney, Craig Barlow. But in September, D'Ellen told the Dallas Morning News that the lawsuit allegations were not true. It's pretty scary, said D'Ellen. I don't know why they would say that unless they're thinking they don't have to pay the money. On one hand, I feel I have an obligation to her, but on the other hand, I don't care if they ever pay it. D'Ellen was now living in Wiley, but Donnie Dial has moved away, and neither they nor Lynn Dial, who was remarried, returned phone calls for this story. Okay, so this story takes place in 1993. So I'm going to pause this here, stop for today, and we're going to come back because, believe it or not, as cut and dried as it seems it should be, it is not. And there is so much more to this story. Thank you for joining us. We are sponsored by LabbratiCreations.com. You can check them out at LabbratiCreations.com, and you can still use the code CRIMEXS for a fun pop pet portrait of your own pet. You can also reach us on Twitter, Instagram at TrueCrimeXS, or you can give us a call if you know anything about any of the cases that we're talking about at 252-365-5593. You can also reach us at Gmail at truecrimexs@gmail.com, and you can check out our website at www.truecrimexs.com. We'll see you next time.
This is True Crime XS.
You think you know me? Yeah, you think you know me? Read the sign of my heart, real bitches only. Ain't got no time for your bullshit. I shoot for stars cause I'm worth it. I bring the heat cause I wanna. You start the beat, then I'm gonna. Ain't got no time to explain myself to anyone else, I'm me. This is the way I am, it's just the way I am. And I wanna dance with you, yeah, I'm your biggest fan. Gotta spark to you, but if they don't understand, tell them that you're coming through, say it's just the way I am. You think you know me? Yeah, you think you know me? Read the sign of my heart, real bitches only. Ain't got no time for your bullshit. I shoot for stars cause I'm worth it. I bring the heat cause I wanna. You start the beat, then I'm gonna. Ain't got no time to explain myself to anyone else, I'm me.